I remember that day as if it were carved into my memory in the harshest way possible. I was driving with Celeste, my wife, on what was meant to be a simple road trip after visiting her sister. The road was long and empty, and the late morning sun cast long shadows over the asphalt. Yet, something felt off from the start. Celeste had been smirking all morning, a smile that was too coy and secretive. It was as if she were hiding a truth from me, a truth that would shatter everything I believed about our life together. I tried to brush away that uneasy feeling, telling myself that maybe she was just playful. But deep down, I sensed trouble brewing. We pulled into a rundown gas station far off the highway, a place that seemed forgotten by time. The station was nearly abandoned. The pumps stood rusted and silent, and the small building's flickering neon sign did little to brighten the faded concrete. As soon as we parked, Celeste turned to me with that same unsettling smile and said in a voice so sweet it bordered on insincere, "Go grab me a coffee, babe." Her tone was light, almost teasing, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I shrugged off the growing anxiety and stepped inside to fetch the coffee, unaware that I was about to cross the threshold into a nightmare. Inside the gas station, the air felt heavy and stale. Every step I took echoed in the emptiness, a constant reminder that I was alone. I filled a paper cup with coffee, the hot liquid barely cutting through the cold dread that was forming in my gut. I glanced at the worn-out clock on the wall and wondered how long I would be away from Celeste. When I finally pushed open the door to return, my heart pounded as I scanned the area for her familiar figure. But there was nothing, no trace of Celeste, no sign of our car, and even my personal belongings had vanished into thin air. My wallet, my bag, my phone, they were all gone. Then, as I stood frozen in disbelief, my phone buzzed. I fumbled to retrieve it and saw a text message that sent a wave of panic crashing over me. "Let's see how long it takes you to get home. Consider this a fun challenge." Face blowing a kiss. The message was taunting, laced with a cruelty that I had never expected from the woman I once loved. I tried to call her, desperate for an explanation, but every ring ended in an empty, echoing voicemail. In that gut-wrenching moment, a cold realization hit me. I wasn't going home, not to Celeste, not ever. I stood there in the barren lot, my fingers still trembling as I clutched the now-cold coffee cup. Every memory of our shared past, the laughter, the whispered secrets, the dreams we once built together, turned bitter in my mouth. I felt betrayed and abandoned, as if my entire life had been a cruel illusion. The gas station, with its peeling paint and forlorn silence, became a grim symbol of the void Celeste had left behind. I realized that this was no ordinary road trip mishap. I had been set up, deceived by the person I had trusted most, and now I was forced to confront a future filled with uncertainty and heartbreak. The lonely wind stirred the dry leaves at my feet, echoing the chaos in my heart as I took my first step into a life I never chose. A life where every moment would remind me of that fateful abandonment and the betrayal that altered everything forever. I stood there on the cracked pavement of that desolate gas station, holding a cup of coffee that was losing its warmth as fast as my hope was melting away. The cold metal of the handle dug into my palm, and with every shiver that ran down my spine, I felt the weight of betrayal press down on me. I couldn't believe that I had been left in that forsaken place, abandoned not by chance, but by the deliberate cruelty of the woman I once loved. Celeste had always claimed that her harsh methods were her way of teaching me life lessons. But now, in this heart-wrenching moment, her lessons left me broken. I was alone with nothing but my fading memories and a bitter sense of loss. My thoughts swirled as I replayed every moment of the morning. Her sly smile as she told me to fetch a coffee, the way her eyes flickered with secret mischief, and that gut-wrenching realization that I was being toyed with. Every detail stung like a fresh cut. I recalled the $160 in my pocket from an earlier stop, a meager sum that, in any other circumstance, might have meant little. But now, it symbolized the only remnant of a life that had suddenly been stripped away. My backpack was still in the car, my wallet, my phone, everything I once held dear had vanished into thin air, leaving me with nothing but the bitter taste of betrayal. The desolation of the empty highway around me mirrored the emptiness I felt inside. I stepped away from the counter, my mind reeling, and sought answers in the silence that enveloped the station. Each step felt heavy as I tried to piece together the fragments of my shattered reality. As I walked back to the car, the cold wind whipped through my hair and carried with it echoes of the past, memories of laughter and shared dreams that now seemed like distant illusions. I wondered how life could turn so dark so quickly, how one moment I had been a man with a future, and the next, a stranded soul grappling with the remnants of a deceitful love. In that moment, something inside me snapped. I wasn't willing to let this betrayal define me, yet the anger was overwhelming. I clenched my fists, feeling a strange mix of sorrow and defiance welling up from deep within. The pain was not just for the loss of my belongings, but for the shattering of trust that I had once believed was unbreakable. I stood at the crossroads of heartbreak and resolve, knowing that from this point forward, nothing would ever be the same. Every footstep echoed with the promise of retribution, and every gust of wind whispered a secret of the past I wished to forget. With each slow, measured breath, I made a silent vow. I would not allow Celeste's betrayal to control my destiny. I decided then and there that I would face the uncertain road ahead with strength and determination, even if it meant leaving behind the fragments of a life I once knew. I stepped away from the station and onto the deserted road, my heart pounding in time with my uncertain steps. In that moment of desolation, as I embraced both the pain and the promise of a future unbound by the chains of deceit, I felt the first stirrings of a new beginning, a beginning that, while steeped in sorrow, would forge a path toward a life defined not by betrayal, but by resilience and the hard-won lessons of a broken heart. Every mile I took became a silent testament to the fact that even in the darkest moments, the human spirit can find a way to fight back and rebuild from the ruins of a shattered past. I still remember the moment when despair turned into a reluctant hope, as if the universe itself was giving me a chance to start over. I dialed the number of the one person who had always cared for me, even when Celeste had pushed everyone away, my sister-in-law, Helen. It was strange how fate worked. Celeste had cut her off long ago, saying Helen was a bad influence, but I knew better. Helen answered on the second ring, her voice warm and steady, filled with concern and a quiet determination. "What happened?" she asked, and I could sense the worry in her tone even before I explained the chaos at the gas station. I told her everything. How Celeste's smirk had hinted at hidden plans, how I had been sent to fetch coffee, and how I returned to find that she, our car, and all my belongings had vanished without a trace. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy, and for a moment, I wondered if I was mistaken, if this was some cruel joke. But then Helen said, "I'll help you, don't worry." In that single phrase lay a lifeline, a promise of support I had not expected but desperately needed. Within minutes, she arranged for a bus ticket and even called a local taxi to pick me up. Her swift actions made me realize that even though Celeste had abandoned me, I was not entirely alone in this battle. The feeling was bittersweet. The warmth of Helen's care contrasted sharply with the cold emptiness left by Celeste's betrayal. Riding in the taxi, I gazed out the window as the world blurred past, a mix of open fields, abandoned roads, and distant city lights. The journey felt surreal, like a bridge between the life I had lost and the uncertain future ahead. I couldn't help but replay the moments of the morning over and over in my mind. Celeste's unnerving smile, the deceptive calm in her voice, and the sudden void when I returned to the gas station. Each memory was a painful reminder of the trust one had placed in her, a trust that had been shattered beyond repair. I felt as if I were traveling not just through miles of road, but through layers of a life I once knew, peeling away until nothing remained but raw, exposed truth. At the bus station, the atmosphere was modest and bustling with travelers, each wrapped up in their own stories of departure and arrival. I sat on a worn bench, the chill of the place seeping into my bones, while my thoughts raced. The bus's engine hummed in the background, a constant rhythm that made me reflect on how life moves forward, regardless of the obstacles that try to hold it back. It was in that moment of stillness that I began to understand the true meaning of a new beginning. This journey was not merely about escaping a painful past, but about reclaiming my own identity, piece by fragile piece. The betrayal that had once defined my existence was slowly giving way to a realization that I was stronger than the hurt, and that there was a future waiting to be built from the remnants of what I had lost. I started to imagine a life where I could rebuild not only my home, but also the parts of me that had been broken. I thought of a small workshop where I could restore old houses, of a modest life filled with honest work and simple pleasures. The idea of creating something meaningful from the debris of my past filled me with a cautious optimism. Each mile on the bus, each quiet moment of reflection, felt like a step toward a new self, a version of me that was not defined by betrayal but by resilience and the will to forge a different path. Helen's kindness had sparked a light in the dark, a reminder that sometimes the most unexpected help can lead to the most profound changes. I continued to reflect on the choices that had led me here. Every decision, every whispered promise, and every silent moment of doubt played together in my mind like a slow, mournful song. I recalled the early days of our marriage, when life seemed full of hope and every challenge was met with a united front. Those memories now felt distant and almost unreal, as if they belonged to a different person altogether. In this moment, separated by time and betrayal, I was forced to acknowledge the painful truth that sometimes the person you love can also be the one who destroys the life you once dreamed of. Yet even in that stark realization, there was a seed of strength, a small, stubborn spark that refused to be extinguished. I promised myself that no matter how deep the wounds, I would strive to heal them, to grow stronger from the pain and rebuild a life that was honest and true to who I was. With every heartbeat, I felt the layers of my past begin to peel away, revealing the raw potential of a future that was waiting just beyond the horizon. The journey ahead was daunting, and I knew that the road to recovery would be long and filled with unexpected twists. Yet, as I sat in that bus station, surrounded by strangers who carried their own stories of loss and hope, I felt an overwhelming sense of possibility. Every face in the crowd represented a chance to start fresh, to leave behind the painful echoes of yesterday, and to build a tomorrow defined by courage and determination. The very idea of starting over, of carving a new path from the fragments of my shattered past, was both terrifying and exhilarating. In that charged atmosphere, I began to see that the end of one story was merely the beginning of another, one that I had the power to write on my own terms. With a quiet resolve settling in my heart, I embraced the uncertainty of the future, understanding that every moment was a blank page waiting to be filled with the story of my resurgence. I looked forward with cautious optimism as the bus continued its steady route along the highway. Each bump and turn, every pause and distant rumble of the engine reminded me that I was leaving behind a world of betrayal and stepping into a realm of potential. I was determined to make every mile count, to honor the past by building a future that was undeniably my own. Every second of that long ride whispered promises of renewal, of a life not shackled by the weight of lost trust, but elevated by the strength found in starting anew. Today, in that crowded bus station and on that endless road, I embraced my new beginning with all the hope, fear, and determination that I could muster. I was in the middle of an important business meeting when a sudden, incessant buzzing shattered the sterile silence of the boardroom. My phone, which had been stowed away in my suit pocket, erupted with notifications, one after another. I glanced at the screen, and my heart sank. There were 39 missed calls. The numbers were unfamiliar, most of them shrouded in mystery, yet 3 of them were from Helen. I knew that voice all too well, panicked, urgent, and laced with emotion. I excused myself from the meeting, leaving behind the cluttered table and the half-finished sentences of my colleagues, and stepped into the cool corridor. With shaking fingers, I pressed play on the first voicemail. Helen's voice, trembling with anxiety, filled my ears as she said, "Call me. It's Celeste. She found you." That single message struck me like a thunderbolt. 2 decades of careful planning, of building a life away from that toxic past, seemed to vanish in an instant. I felt as though my carefully constructed world was collapsing around me. I continued to listen, my pulse racing, as another message from Celeste followed. Her tone was demanding and fragile at the same time. "You can't ignore me forever. We need to talk." And then came a third message, a flood of sobbing and desperate pleas. "I know I hurt you, but you're my husband. I made one mistake. You owe me at least a conversation. The raw emotion in her voice made my stomach churn with revulsion and disbelief. I had spent so many years trying to escape the poisonous cycle she had created. Now, faced with these messages, I felt the old wounds reopening. I stood there, feeling trapped between memories of betrayal and a past I thought was buried for good. Every ring, every vibration on my phone, was a reminder that the life I had fought so hard to build was now under threat. I replayed each voicemail in my mind, trying to grasp the full weight of what was happening. Celeste's voice, once a source of warmth and comfort, now seemed to carry only malice and regret. It was as if she were reaching out from a dark abyss, demanding that I acknowledge her presence, that I somehow return to the life we once shared, even though I had long since abandoned that destructive chapter. In that moment of disillusionment, I realized that the past was not ready to let me go. The very phone that had become my lifeline to a new beginning now pulsed with the ghost of a relationship I had hoped was over. Anger and sorrow warred within me as I stared at the screen, unable to decide whether to call back or simply walk away. I thought of the countless nights I had spent planning a future free from Celeste's manipulations, of the long road I had traveled to reclaim my identity and self-worth. And now, in a cruel twist of fate, everything I had built was in jeopardy. I recalled the countless lessons I had learned about trust and betrayal, and the bitter realization that some scars never truly fade. As I stood there in the quiet corridor, the noise of the boardroom fading into a distant hum, I felt the gravity of my situation settle over me like a heavy shroud. The messages were not just calls for attention. They were a summons from a past that refused to be ignored, a past that demanded to be confronted, regardless of how painful it might be. Determined not to let this intrusion derail the progress I had made, I composed a brief text to Helen. Meeting tomorrow. Denny's on 5th, 7 a.m. Come alone. In that short message, I found a semblance of control, a single decision in a moment when everything else seemed out of my grasp. I knew that facing Celeste again was inevitable, that the unresolved anger and betrayal would have to be confronted sooner or later. With the text sent, I took a deep breath, trying to steady the rapid beating of my heart, and resolved to face whatever came next with the same determination that had carried me through the darkest moments of my past. In that quiet corridor, amid the echoes of 39 missed calls and the ghosts of a painful history, I embraced the painful truth. The road ahead was fraught with uncertainty, but I was ready to face it head-on, even if it meant revisiting wounds I had long thought healed. I sat in the quiet booth of a small roadside diner, waiting for Helen to arrive. The air in the diner was heavy with the aroma of fresh coffee and warm pastries, a stark contrast to the bitter taste of betrayal that still lingered in my heart. I remember the moment Helen stepped in, looking older yet still carrying the same nervous energy I had known since our younger days. Her eyes darted around the room as if she carried a secret too heavy to hold. Without wasting another second, she slid into the booth across from me and blurted out, "He's in deep trouble. Bad trouble." Her voice trembled with urgency, and I could see the worry etched on her face. I leaned forward, setting my untouched cup of coffee on the table, and said in a quiet, steady tone, "Tell me everything." Helen took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts before she began to unravel the shocking news. Apparently, Celeste had not only left, but had also racked up massive debts that threatened to ruin her completely. Her credit cards were maxed out, her house teetered on the edge of foreclosure, and worst of all, she had been searching for me for months. It was not that she missed our past or felt any true remorse for what she had done. She was driven by a desperate need for money, a need that she hoped I would somehow fulfill. Listening to her words, I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. Memories of our early days together surfaced, days filled with hope, dreams, and promises of forever. But those memories had long since turned bitter, overshadowed by Celeste's calculated cruelty. I wondered how someone I once loved so dearly could descend into such depths of greed and despair. The realization struck me hard. The woman who had shared my life had become a stranger, one whose actions were now guided solely by self-interest and financial desperation. Helen continued, her voice soft yet firm, explaining how Celeste had lost control of her life. Every phone call and letter that I had once dismissed as insignificant now painted a picture of a woman drowning in her own mistakes. I remembered the times I had ignored the small red flags, the subtle hints that something was not right. Now, it all came rushing back in a torrent of regret and sorrow. I felt trapped between a past that was impossible to forget and a future that was quickly becoming uncertain. In that small booth, with the soft murmur of other patrons in the background, I realized that this confrontation was inevitable. I had to face the consequences of a life built on broken trust and shattered dreams. I sipped my coffee slowly, each sip grounding me in the reality that I could no longer run from the past. The diner, with its worn-out decor and the comforting clink of cutlery, became a silent witness to my inner turmoil. I had no desire to see Celeste again, yet the ties of our shared history were too strong to sever completely. As Helen finished her account, I could feel the weight of her words pressing down on me. I knew that the showdown with Celeste was not a matter of if, but when. In that moment, sitting alone in that modest booth, I made a decision. I would no longer let her control my life from the shadows. I would confront this mess head-on, no matter how painful it might be. The thought of facing Celeste filled me with a mix of dread and determination, a determination to reclaim the parts of me that had been lost in the chaos of our past. I glanced around the diner, at the ordinary faces and everyday conversations, and realized that life continued despite the upheaval. It was a small comfort, knowing that the world moved on even as my own life was in turmoil. Today, in that unassuming booth at a roadside diner, I vowed to stand up for myself and to finally draw a line under the years of deceit. The showdown was coming, and I would meet it not as a broken man, but as someone who had learned the hard lessons of betrayal and was ready to build a future free from the chains of the past. The hours in that diner seemed to stretch endlessly, each minute filled with silent reflections and a growing resolve. I thought about all the sacrifices I had made, the dreams that had been shattered, and the future that was now uncertain. Every word Helen spoke echoed in my mind, mingling with the quiet hum of the diner's old jukebox playing in the corner. The soft tunes brought back memories of simpler times, times when hope was not yet a distant memory and trust had not been so brutally broken. Now, with every beat of my heart, I felt a determination rising inside me. I was ready to face whatever came next, even if it meant reopening old wounds and stepping into a painful confrontation with the past. I sat back, my eyes fixed on the window as I watched the rain begin to fall softly outside. Each raindrop mirrored the tears I had shed in silence, the grief of a love lost and a life undone. Yet, in that quiet moment, I also saw the promise of renewal, a chance to rebuild my life brick by brick, free from the shadows of deception. I knew the path ahead would be fraught with difficulty, but I was prepared to walk it with a steady heart and a clear mind. The diner, the rain, and the quiet resolve inside me all marked the beginning of a new chapter, one where I would finally reclaim control and let go of the past that had once held me captive. The next morning, I sat at my office desk, reviewing some documents, when the unexpected happened. The glass doors of the conference room parted and there she was, Celeste, my former wife, accompanied by a man I barely recognized, his presence marking him as her new husband, Mark. I felt a chill, as if the room's temperature had dropped instantly. I had heard whispers about Celeste remarrying, but nothing prepared me for the shock of seeing her standing there, feigning tears and wearing a forced smile that did little to hide the desperation in her eyes. Her gaze locked onto mine through the clear glass, and in that moment, every lie and every betrayal of the past came flooding back. I remembered the lonely gas station abandonment, the cruel text messages, and the cold realization that my life had been shattered. Now, here she was, back in my life, expecting me to take on her burdens without a second thought. "Oh my God, look at you," she gasped in a tone that mixed surprise with something I couldn't quite place as remorse. "I knew you'd be successful." But her voice, which once carried promises of love and security, now sounded hollow and rehearsed. I remained seated, my face set in a mask of calm that barely concealed the storm raging inside. "Sit down," I said, my voice even but laced with a hint of cold finality. Mark shifted awkwardly beside her, his discomfort obvious as he avoided my gaze. The air in the room grew thick with tension, and I could feel every eye on us as we prepared for the inevitable confrontation. Celeste began, her words stumbling out in a desperate attempt to reclaim what she had lost. "I made one little mistake," she started, but I cut her off sharply. "You left me at a gas station," I stated firmly, the words hanging between us like an accusation that could not be ignored. Her face flushed with anger and embarrassment as she tried to continue. "We came back," she whined, her voice trembling with a mix of indignation and fear. "Too late," I replied, and the finality in my tone left no room for further argument. The facade crumbled quickly after that. With a sudden change in her expression, Celeste dropped the pretense entirely and spoke with an unsettling bluntness. "Fine. We need $175,000. You're rich. Just help us out," she demanded, her eyes darting between mine and Mark's, as if expecting me to magically conjure a solution to the ruin she had created. I leaned back slowly, reaching into the drawer of my desk to pull out a thick folder that contained all the evidence of my success, my achievements, and the hard-won life I'd built since she had abandoned me. I looked at her with a mix of pity and resolve as I said, "Funny you should mention your house. I bought your mortgage." The words, simple yet devastating, were delivered in a tone that carried the weight of years of betrayal and self-reliance. A heavy silence fell over the room. Mark's face turned ashen and Celeste's eyes widened in shock, the full meaning of my words sinking in. For a long, heavy moment, we all sat in the stillness, the only sounds the distant hum of the city outside and the rapid beating of my heart. I remembered every detail of the betrayal, every scar left by Celeste's choices. I had spent years trying to build something authentic out of the ruins of our past, a life where I would never again allow someone to treat me as disposable. Her sudden return, with Mark as a silent accomplice in her desperate scheme, felt like a final attempt to drag me back into the vortex of her chaos. My mind raced as I thought about every promise she had broken, every hope she had shattered. I had learned that trust is a fragile thing, easily broken by lies and selfish desires. Now, faced with the tangible consequences of her actions, I realized that some wounds run too deep to ever truly heal. The documents in the folder were not just pieces of paper, but symbols of my hard work, resilience, and the stark contrast between the life I had rebuilt and the toxic past I had left behind. I could see the fear in Mark's eyes as he glanced between Celeste and me, a silent acknowledgement that he was caught in a situation beyond his control. Celeste's pleas turned to silent sobs as she realized that her desperate demands were met with an unyielding wall of truth. I felt a sense of liberation in that moment, as if every painful memory was being purged with the finality of my words. The confrontation was not merely an exchange of accusations. It was a declaration of independence, a severing of ties with a life that had long been mired in deceit. As the tension slowly ebbed, I knew that this was the turning point, the moment when I truly let go of the past. I glanced at the clock on the wall, its ticking a steady affirmation of time moving forward, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding beneath its gaze. Every second that passed was a step away from the pain and toward a future that I had carefully crafted, a future where my worth was defined by my own hands, not by the demands of a woman who had long ago abandoned loyalty for convenience. In that silent aftermath, as I gathered my papers and steeled myself for the journey ahead, I made a solemn promise to myself. I would never allow the past to dictate my future, and I would ensure that the lessons learned from this confrontation would serve as the foundation of a new chapter in my life, a chapter marked by clarity, strength, and an unwavering commitment to self-respect. I left the room that day with a sense of finality, knowing that while the scars of betrayal might never fully fade, they would serve as constant reminders of the resilience and determination that had brought me to this moment of liberation. I never imagined that the fallout from that fateful confrontation would leave such a deep scar on my soul. In the weeks after Celeste and Mark had confronted me, I found myself caught between memories of a painful past and the uncertain hope of a future I was forced to rebuild alone. Every day felt like walking through a dense fog where every step stirred up old memories of betrayal and heartbreak. I would wake up in the quiet of my empty home, the silence around me echoing the loss of the life I once thought we had shared. The images of that lonely gas station, the cold text messages, and the bitter exchange in my office replayed in my mind relentlessly. The shock of seeing Celeste, desperate and demanding, still haunted me. I could not shake the feeling that everything had collapsed into a void where trust and love no longer existed. In the solitude of long, restless nights, I examined every detail of our shattered past. I recalled the false promises and the careless lies that had paved the way for this downfall. The remnants of our once bright life now lay scattered like broken glass, each shard cutting into my heart as I tried to piece together a semblance of who I once was. I found myself questioning every decision, every moment when I had turned a blind eye to her subtle hints of deceit. The fallout was more than just the loss of my belongings or the collapse of our shared dreams. It was the painful revelation that I had allowed myself to be blinded by love and hope. Yet, in that darkness, I began to see a faint light. I slowly learned that grief, as all-consuming as it felt, could also be a catalyst for change. Determined to reclaim what little I had left, I sought refuge in the simplicity of everyday life. I returned to the routine of small tasks, organizing my scattered papers, tending to my modest garden, and taking long walks in the nearby park where nature offered a silent, healing presence. Each day, as I sat on a weathered bench beneath an ancient oak, I allowed the cool breeze and the rustling leaves to remind me that life, despite its harsh twists, still moved forward. I reached out to old friends and even considered professional help, not because I was weak, but because I recognized that rebuilding a life from the ruins required strength and support. The fallout had stripped away the pretenses and left me raw and exposed, yet it also gifted me the opportunity to confront my own vulnerabilities. I began to understand that true recovery was not about forgetting the past, but rather learning from it, accepting that the pain was a part of my story while refusing to let it define my future. In quiet moments of introspection, I found that forgiveness was not for Celeste or Mark, but for myself, a chance to free my heart from the weight of resentment and sorrow. As the days turned into weeks, I discovered small victories that rekindled my sense of self. A smile from a stranger on the street, a kind word from a neighbor, and the simple act of watching the sunrise reminded me that life was still worth living. Every morning, as I watched the first light break through the darkness, I made a silent vow to move forward, no matter how slowly. I recognized that the fallout was a turning point, a painful ending that also held the seed of a new beginning. I began to rebuild my life piece by piece, carving out moments of joy amid the lingering ache of loss. Slowly, I learned to let go of the past and embrace the uncertain beauty of a future that I was now determined to shape with my own hands. I understood that the scars I bore were not just marks of betrayal, but also symbols of resilience and hard-won wisdom. With each passing day, the raw pain softened into a quiet determination. I realized that while the fallout had changed me forever, it had also prepared me to build something stronger, something that would honor my journey through despair and lead me to a place of healing. I stepped forward into the unknown with a heart that had learned to hope again, even as it carried the deep echoes of yesterday. I remember the day clearly, as if every moment was etched into my mind with searing intensity. It wasn't enough to simply take their house. I had to destroy the very symbol of all the lies and pain. I arranged for a demolition crew to come at first light, a decision that felt both inevitable and necessary. I had spent years building a new life from the ruins of our past, a life I had painstakingly assembled piece by piece. Standing outside the house that had once been Celeste's refuge from reality, I cradled a cup of coffee in my hand, its warmth a small comfort amid the chill of impending retribution. The house, a crumbling monument to the betrayal and neglect that had defined our past, seemed almost to tremble under the weight of its own history. In that moment, I realized that this was not merely about revenge. It was about delivering justice for the years I had suffered in silence, for every shattered hope and every lost dream. I watched as the demolition crew set to work, their heavy machinery rumbling like the beating of a furious heart. The sound of metal crashing against concrete filled the air, a relentless percussion that drowned out the echoes of my own thoughts. Each strike, each burst of dust and debris, felt like a cleansing force, a final severance of the toxic ties that had bound me to a painful past. Helen stood nearby, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and quiet approval, as if witnessing the collapse of that house meant witnessing the fall of an old, destructive order. I could see in her gaze that she too recognized the symbolic significance of this act. For me, it was not an outburst of uncontrolled rage, but rather a measured, deliberate step toward reclaiming my future. Every broken brick, every splinter of wood, represented the shattering of a life I had once known, a life where I had been manipulated, used, and ultimately abandoned. The demolition wasn't performed in haste. I had meticulously planned every detail, ensuring that each moment of destruction would mark the end of an era defined by deceit and betrayal. As I stood there, the steady hiss of hydraulic presses and the thunder of collapsing walls combined to form a symphony of finality. I felt an odd mixture of relief and melancholy, a recognition that the destruction of the house was also the destruction of a chapter of my life I had been forced to close. I sipped my coffee slowly, the bitter liquid matching the taste of the past I was determined to leave behind. The crew worked methodically, their actions precise and unyielding, mirroring the resolve that had grown within me over the years. In that space between the sound of demolition and the silence that followed each collapse, I heard the echoes of every whispered promise and every lie that had been uttered under that roof. Now, as the structure began to crumble into irretrievable rubble, I felt a strange liberation. The house, a physical representation of the false love and broken trust one had once known, was finally being reduced to dust. I could see Celeste's face in every shattered fragment, a painful reminder of a woman who had promised everything and delivered nothing but heartache. And as I stood there, I realized that it wasn't merely the house that was burning down. It was the last vestige of a past that had kept me captive for far too long. Mark's angry departure had already signaled the end of an era, but this final act of demolition was my declaration that I would no longer be tethered to memories of betrayal. In that raw, unfiltered moment, I found the strength to embrace a future free from the toxic remnants of what once was. The ground trembled beneath the falling debris, and with each collapse, I felt the weight of regret and sorrow lifting off my shoulders. I knew that the journey ahead would be long and fraught with its own challenges, but the ruin of that house gave me the courage to believe that I could rebuild my life on my own terms. As the dust settled and the echoes of destruction faded into an eerie silence, I felt an overwhelming sense of finality. The act of burning it all down was not driven by a desire for petty revenge, but by a deep, abiding need for justice. A justice that would allow me to move forward unburdened by the ghosts of the past. In that silence, punctuated only by the fading roar of machinery and the whisper of the wind, I vowed to never again allow myself to be defined by the cruelty of another. I would rebuild, not for anyone else, but for me, a man who had learned that sometimes, to truly start over, one must first let everything else burn away. I had reached a turning point where I could no longer be defined by the bitter memories of betrayal. Standing on the barren plot of land where Celeste's ruined house had once stood, I felt both sorrow and a burning resolve. This empty space was not merely soil and dust. It was the blank page on which I would write a new story. I decided to build affordable housing here, a safe haven for those who had been crushed by life's hardships, especially for single parents escaping toxic relationships. I envisioned a place where people, battered by their pasts, could rebuild their lives with dignity and hope. I named this project Lillian Place in honor of Helen, the one family member who had stood by me through every dark moment, offering kindness when I had none left to give. Every brick laid and every nail hammered at Lillian Place carried a part of my own journey from despair to renewal. I never intended to create a mansion or luxurious apartments. My goal was simple yet profound. A modest community where support replaced judgment and every resident could begin to heal. I spent long hours at the construction site, overseeing every detail, ensuring that the structure would serve as a beacon of new beginnings rather than a monument to old wounds. Neighbors, local volunteers, and even strangers touched by my story came together, drawn by the promise of transformation. With every shovelful of earth moved and every wall raised, I felt the heavy burden of the past lighten, replaced by a quiet pride that only comes from rebuilding a life on one's own terms. Then, on a cool autumn morning, as I was reviewing blueprints in my modest office on site, my phone rang, a call from Celeste. Her voice trembled on the line, filled with desperation and regret. It was surreal. The woman who had shattered my world now sought my help. I agreed to meet her in my office, determined that this encounter would serve as the final closure to our painful history. When Celeste arrived, her eyes were wild with a mix of defiance and sorrow. I handed her a rental application for one of the units in Lillian Place. "You're welcome to apply," I said simply, my tone leaving no doubt that this offer was not charity but the natural consequence of the choices she had made. Celeste's face contorted with anger as she sputtered, "After everything I did for you?" I only offered a quiet smile, for the irony was clear. The help she now sought was exactly what she had earned through her actions. That moment, charged with the residue of our past, confirmed that my future, and that of Lillian Place, would be built on justice tempered with compassion. In the months that followed, Lillian Place grew into a vibrant community. I walked its corridors and quiet courtyards, listening to the stories of those who had found refuge within its walls. I heard tales of hardship and survival, of hope rekindled in the face of overwhelming odds. Each new resident brought their own scars, and yet together they formed a tapestry of resilience that inspired me daily. Their laughter, quiet conversations, and the determined look in their eyes reminded me that from the deepest pain, beauty could still arise. Every time I saw a child running freely or an elder sharing wisdom with a neighbor, I knew that the journey from despair to hope was possible, not just for me, but for all who had ever been cast aside. I discovered that the true reward of building Lillian Place was not measured in dollars or square footage, but in the strength and courage of those who chose to start over. Here, in this little community, the ghosts of my past were slowly replaced by the promise of a new future. Each day, I felt the power of healing and the transformative force of kindness. I had built more than just affordable housing. I had built a symbol of rebirth, a sanctuary where broken lives could mend and dreams could take root. I learned that even when the pain of betrayal cuts deep, it can eventually give way to growth and a renewed sense of purpose. Every brick of Lillian Place told a story of loss, of love betrayed, and ultimately, of the strength it takes to rebuild from nothing. I had turned the remnants of my shattered past into a foundation for the future, and in doing so, I had discovered that hope, once kindled, can light even the darkest paths. I stared at the horizon as the first light of dawn broke through the darkness of my past, each ray a reminder that nothing truly ends, it only transforms. I had rebuilt my life from the ruins of betrayal and heartache, brick by brick and tear by tear, and now I stood at the edge of a future that was as uncertain as it was promising. The lessons I learned through every moment of suffering, every act of defiance, and every small victory had forged in me an unyielding strength. I realized that the final lesson was not about retribution or punishment, but about the acceptance of change and the willingness to let go of the chains that once bound me to a life I no longer recognized. In the quiet solitude of my study, with the soft hum of the morning wind outside, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. The past was a collection of vivid memories, painful yet instructive, and I understood that to truly move forward, I had to embrace every shard of my former self, even those that were broken beyond repair. I recalled the cold, lonely hours at the desolate gas station, the bitter taste of betrayal when Celeste vanished without warning, leaving behind not only my possessions, but also the remnants of a shared dream. I remembered the storm of missed calls that shattered the fragile peace I had built over the years, each ring a ghost of a past that I desperately tried to leave behind. And then there was the final confrontation, when I looked into the eyes of a woman I once loved, and in that moment, I recognized the futility of holding on to what had been lost. I realized that forgiveness was not about condoning the pain inflicted upon me, but about freeing myself from the relentless grip of anger and regret. It was a lesson carved deep into my soul, a lesson that taught me that the path to true liberation lay in accepting the impermanence of life. Every decision I had made, every step I took away from the darkness, was a silent promise to myself that I would never allow the past to dictate my future. The demolition of Celeste's house, the creation of Lillian Place, and the painful conversations that followed were all chapters in a story that was finally coming full circle. I understood that the scars I bore were not symbols of weakness, but of survival. They reminded me that even in the midst of devastation, there could be rebirth, and that every ending paved the way for a new beginning. As I sat there, a gentle smile played on my lips, a quiet acknowledgement of all I had endured and all I had overcome. The world outside was vast and ever-changing, and in its constant motion, I found solace. I resolved that from this day forward, I would live with intention and compassion, never forgetting the trials that had shaped me, yet refusing to be defined by them. I had learned that true strength came from within, and that every challenge, no matter how insurmountable it seemed, was an opportunity to grow. In the soft glow of the rising sun, I made a vow to honor my past without letting it shackle my spirit. I would embrace each new day with hope and determination, carrying with me the wisdom of my experiences and the promise of a future unburdened by regret. This was my final lesson, a quiet, enduring truth that no matter how harsh the journey, the human spirit has the power to rise, rebuild, and ultimately find peace.